All right, workflows in phases. So the goal for today is we're going to take one long workflow and we're going to break it up into 3 logical phases to create a few shorter workflow templates that are going to be more flexible and manageable. So I'm going to go through some of the big benefits to splitting a workflow up into multiple phases. As with most situations with SAM webinars, they're not necessarily geared towards brand new Dubsado users. We do have lots of webinars to help with that. But in this webinar, I'm assuming that you are familiar with building workflows. Hopefully you've built a workflow before, or maybe you're checking things out to get some inspiration. But definitely I'm assuming you're familiar with workflow actions and triggers. I have some links here where you can find webinars on those. And it's also going to be important to be comfortable and familiar with all the different ways that a workflow can be applied to a project in Dubsado. So number one, you've got automatically applying a workflow through a lead capture being filled out. That's one of the most popular. But keep in mind that you can also manually apply a workflow to any project by going to the Workflows tab of that project and selecting the workflow you'd like to apply. And finally, there's actually a way to apply a workflow using the Start a Workflow action inside of another workflow. So we're going to be actually looking at all 3 today for our 3 different phases. Okay, before we jump in, I have 3, I call them workflow must-knows to share with you. And the reason I want to bring these up is because some of the issues that come up with just a couple of the quirky things that workflows do can actually be solved by doing workflows in phases. So I just wanted to kind of pull these up at the beginning, keep them in the back of your mind, and we'll see how these things get addressed. So number 1, if you have an action that is triggered by a project date anywhere in the workflow, so we're talking anything like 14 days before the project start date or 1 day after the project end date. So you have something based on a project date there. Anytime you have that, the action will trigger on that date, regardless of whether or not the client has signed your contract and paid a deposit. So theoretically, if you have a workflow on a project where it's the whole workflow covers the whole process in one workflow template, and you have a client who does not complete their booking and they maybe fall off the map, don't finish paying you, if you don't stop it, it is a potential that that client will still get some emails around that project date if you did have one set and you had these triggers in there. So we're going to look at how phases can help us mitigate that. Additionally, when you apply a workflow to a project, any forms that are being sent as a part of that workflow are going to be immediately added to the project, even if they're not sending right away. So anytime you have a workflow that has a send form action, we have a couple in here, those forms are being added to the project under the Forms tab as soon as the workflow gets applied. So if we're sending a proposal and an intake questionnaire, even if those forms are not sending out right away, as soon as I put the workflow on the project, copies of those forms are being added into the project to send later. It's not necessarily so much of an issue in most cases, but it's just something good to be aware of as we go through this. And finally, when you specify a payment schedule on a workflow, and what I'm talking about here is as you build your workflow template, we open this up here at the top, you have your payment schedule that you can set. This is if you want to trigger other actions off of a scheduled payment being completed. So when you do this, as soon as you apply the workflow to the project, it's going to create an empty invoice, a $0 invoice with that payment schedule applied. What the workflow is doing is it's kind of setting the foundation for that invoice. So it's putting the payment schedule on the invoice itself so it knows, okay, these are the due dates I'm going to watch. So by the workflow setting it up, that is how it's able to watch for those payments to be triggered. And if you are also sending a proposal and you put a payment schedule in the proposal, you might have noticed it causes an error because the proposal tries to override the payment schedule that the workflow did. And the workflow is like, where was that payment schedule I put? Now I don't know what payment to watch for. So something we're going to be talking about as we go along is this idea of making sure that the workflow is the one responsible for applying the payment schedule. If you're worried about triggering actions off of scheduled payments, such as a client making a deposit, we want to make sure that we have that set up correctly. But one, kind of potential thing you can run into is, when that invoice is being created. So we're going to address that as well. Okay, so I want to talk through a couple of benefits to why it's a good idea to actually break up your workflow. So we're talking about having one long workflow here. This one is by far not the longest one that I've seen, but it is what I prepared as the example for today. But we're talking about, why would we want to break this one up into more workflows? Sometimes I hear a little bit of pushback about this. I don't want too many workflow templates to keep track of. I didn't want to set up so many workflows. You can kind of reframe this a little bit as the number of workflows you have doesn't actually matter so much as just making sure that everything is working the way that you want it to. So if it means that your process is going to run more smoothly because your workflow is actually made up of 3 workflows than of 1, in the long run, it's actually no different than if you just set up that big long workflow. So let's go through a few of these benefits here. Number 1, the project date trigger protection. So this is what I was talking about before. When you have an action in that workflow that is triggered by a project date, it doesn't care if the client finished their booking or not, it's going to run. So how do we fix this? We actually break up the workflow in such a way that any actions revolving around a project date are moved into an entirely separate workflow template so that that template is not even being applied to the project unless all of your booking requirements have been met. So we'll take a look at what that looks like, but just for now, know that it's possible to go through that booking process with your client and not have any actions looking at the project date until you're ready for that. It can also prevent an invoice from being created too early. So if your workflow is sending a proposal, an invoice is going to be created as soon as the workflow is added to the project. This is because anytime you add a proposal to a project, it too sets up a blank invoice. So with phases, you can actually delay adding the workflow that is going to result in creating that new invoice until you're actually at the stage where you're ready to send the proposal. This kind of goes hand in hand with the payment schedule, and we'll talk about that more when we get to the hands-on portion. We have some, just other benefits as well that are not necessarily technical, but shorter workflows are going to be easier to read and digest. So if you are looking through this big long workflow when you're on someone's project and you need to edit an email to customize it, there are potentially a lot of steps to look through, and it can be a little bit tough to do that. So it's just nice to have shorter workflows. I don't have a hard number for you, like 6 actions, 10 actions. I don't want to restrict you to a certain number of actions that you want to limit yourself on, but just any way that you can kind of compress the workflow templates a little bit is just going to make reading them and skimming them a little bit easier on you. So that's also going to make it easier to spot potential errors or issues when you have less steps to read at a time. I don't know if anyone else has gone through this. I certainly have. You're building a very long workflow and you're trying to review it and make sure you got everything right. And all the steps kind of start to blend together. So having these shorter workflows are going to make things a little bit easier to read. More workflows are also going to make your process more flexible. So I've talked about in the past how workflows in Dubsado are not terribly flexible. They are linear, and they require that good set process up front, so that you're ready for that workflow to to run beginning to end. We don't do a lot of branching off into if this then that. They're pretty linear. So when you have multiple workflows, that's actually going to give you multiple entry points into the process. So if you just have one workflow that starts at the beginning and ends at the end, that's your only option. But if you have 3 workflows and one starts at the beginning, one starts at the middle, and the last one starts 2/3 of the way through, then you now have a little bit more flexibility if you have a client coming in halfway down the pipeline, if you're trying to migrate clients over to Dubsado, clients with special circumstances. It's just going to give you some more flexibility. It also lets you kind of change routes halfway through. So if everyone has to go through the same inquiry process, but you kind of figure out what services they need, and different services require different steps that you need to take. You can have one main inquiry workflow, and then you can decide to apply like A, B, or C, depending on the client's needs. So it's just going to give you more flexibility. And one of my favorites is it can help you with what I like to call zombie clients. Those clients who tried to book you a while ago and maybe fell off the map. And we've all had them. They come back 6, 10, 12 months later, and they say, hey, remember that project? Can we actually get going on that? Well, in that time span, maybe your process has changed. And the steps you want to go through with them now are different than the steps that were in place when they originally booked. So now you have some flexibility to allow that process to update over time. And that takes me into my kind of last main benefit of breaking up your workflows, is that it's going to be better for long-term maintenance. So if you are, for instance, going to change your proposal and booking process, you want to change some of the steps around, maybe change some of the emails go out, just a natural part of growing in your business and discovering new things. If you have one long workflow, you need to change the whole workflow, and then let that change trickle into new clients as they start to sign up with you. But anyone who has inquired previously, they're going to be stuck on that kind of whole workflow as it previously was, because it's already been applied to their project. But now, all you need to do if you're changing one piece of the process is those changes are sort of isolated to one of your workflow phases. And anyone who hasn't inquired yet or hasn't gotten to that step yet, you can be confident in that they will get that next updated version of the workflow. It's a little tricky to wrap your head around, but just understanding that when you apply a workflow to a project, it's like applying a form template. Changes you make to the workflow template are not going to affect the workflow that's already been applied to the project. So there are some things you can do to make changes. You can go in manually and make changes. We do have an update project workflows button, but I very rarely recommend that you use it, just because if you have lots of clients at lots of different stages in the process, the results can get a little bit confusing. So what I normally recommend is that if you need to make changes to a workflow, for future clients, that you let existing clients kind of finish out on the current process, and then let new ones come in and kind of start going through that new version of the workflow. So essentially, by breaking it up, you're just cutting down the time it takes for new clients to get on that on those new steps further down the line. Hopefully that's making sense. I can certainly answer questions on that later. Okay, so I have a couple of different examples for workflow phases for you, just to get some inspiration going. There's no one-size-fits-all approach to this, so you do have to examine your own process and identify those logical transitions between phases. Again, this is not about saying, okay, every 10 steps, I'm going to break off the workflow. No, 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 no. We're not doing that. We're looking for logical transitions between, different phases of your process. So if we think about, project statuses, think about incorporating project status changes into the workflow. For instance, going from new inquiry to consultation booked to proposal sent. It's not necessary that every single status change equals a separate workflow phase. One phase of your workflow might encompass, 2 or 3 status changes. So again, it's still not quite down to that. We're just looking for those really big breaks, kind of like one level higher than the project status changes. So the hands-on example we're going to go through is like a basic 3-phase workflow. So you have one workflow that covers the initial inquiry, so from the lead capture form through booking a consultation, for example. A second workflow is going to pick up after the consultation with sending the proposal all the way through getting the client booked. So it's a little bit of a shorter phase. And the last phase would be starting with your onboarding email all the way through to finishing the project. And you can certainly use this as a starting point, and maybe there are more phases in this actual work portion, depending on how big your projects are. I have some other, kind of industry-specific examples that I've run into. So for weddings and events, it's going to follow a very similar couple of first phases here with initial inquiry, sending the proposal, and then, kind of starting the initial work. But I've seen some wedding and event industry folks set up additional workflows that cover everything that needs to be done 2 months before the event, everything that needs to be done 2 weeks before the event, everything after the event. So you can kind of look at those if you have a set timeline, you can kind of consider that. For coaches and consultants, again, that first portion is going to be very similar: inquiry, proposal, onboarding, initial prep work. But, this is a kind of interesting concept. You could then move them on to kind of called it a main work phase, or really just kind of like active clients. Maybe that doesn't require a lot of automation. Again, these are, just some ideas. But towards the end, maybe you have to split up the offboarding a little bit. So you have a workflow that covers a contract ending, if they're going to end their contract with you, or you can have a different workflow that covers renewing the contract. So you have some different options there, or direct offboarding. I think what I meant by contract ending is, hey, like your contract is coming due. How do you want to proceed? That might be either combined, these two as one phase, or this is a different one. Again, you're looking at your own personal workflows and deciding what is going to be most clear to you and what's going to work best in your situation. Okay, so let's take a look at the hands-on example. In the handout, I did include a screenshot of the entire workflow. And I kind of drew in these big lines where we're planning on breaking it up. So as I mentioned, I'm going to do kind of a 3-phase approach here. We're going to have the kind of initial inquiry phase at the beginning, a proposal phase in the middle, and then the third phase is going to be once the client is booked. So that's how we're going to approach this. So when breaking up a workflow in Dubsado, oftentimes you'll probably be starting with a full workflow to begin with. That's fine. It's also okay if you're planning workflows out and you want to plan the phases. That works too. Personally, I tend to start with one big long workflow, and then the phases kind of start to make themselves clear to me as I'm going through, unless there's something where I absolutely know it needs to be moved into a different workflow, like something with a project date. So I kind of let it tell me what it needs in a sense. But you can absolutely start with the full version, and I'll show you how to approach that. Or you can start by planning this out and make your workflows separate. If you're starting with the full version of your workflow, my recommendation is to go ahead, think about what the phases are. We know we want 3. And right over here, we have the workflow open on the template page. There's a little duplicate icon. I'll try to, it's a little bit bigger. There is a duplicate button here, so you can make a few copies of this workflow. I find this to be the fastest method. You make as many copies of the workflow as you need to make your phases. And always keep an extra copy of the full workflow in case you mess up and you want to go back to where you started. Never a bad idea to save a backup like that. Okay, so this is what I've done. These are all identical. I just renamed them, but these are all just copies of this original full workflow. I just renamed them so that we can kind of look at them one by one. So let's talk about the inquiry phase. So in the inquiry phase, we just want to get through the client booking their consultation. So here's the assumption I'm making in this workflow. And I guess I should also kind of just give you a quick overview of what the process is. We're starting from a lead capture form. We're going to send out a quick email to say, hey, thanks for inquiring. We have to check availability before sending out a scheduler invite to book a consultation. And then after that consultation, we want to send out a proposal so they can fill that out. And I worked in here as well a reminder just to give them a nudge if they didn't fill out the proposal within 2 days. We're going to hold the next step until the contract is signed and the first payment is complete. So we're looking at our payment schedule there. And then after they're booked, so they've signed and paid, we're going to send out an intake questionnaire. We have a little nudge if they've not filled out that form within 10 days. And then after that happens, we are going to have a to-do to start work for the client. Whoops, here we go. This should be after form is completed, by the way, intake questionnaire. So after they complete the questionnaire, we want to start work for the client. And then we have some maybe check-ins at the end. So I'm assuming that the client is giving me their project date on the lead capture form. So these dates are being set at the beginning of the process. Okay, so in our inquiry phase, we just want to go through the client booking the consultation. The reason for this is that anytime there's a consultation, I make the assumption that the decision is being made on that call, whether or not the client wants to go forward. And even if 9 times out of 10 they do go forward, it's nice just to make sure it's built into your workflow to allow for that decision. So this is fine in the sense that we have an action here. It's waiting for our approval. Proposal is not going to go out automatically. So even if it was a no on the call, we still have control over that. But I'll remind you, as we talked about at the beginning, as soon as you are sending a proposal in a workflow, and as soon as you have a payment schedule here, an invoice is going to be created right away. That means that as soon as every client fills out a lead capture form, we have a blank invoice being created. It's not the end of the world, but I know some of you are a little worried about invoice numbering and you don't like seeing those empty invoices. That's okay. And this process is going to help control that. So basically what we're doing is just starting this very simple workflow from the lead capture form. And then at this point, everything after the consultation, we're putting into different workflows. So I'm going to go through and I'm just going to remove all the actions I don't need from this phase. This is why you're making those copies, because it's so much faster to click remove on all of these actions and you have your phase right here. A couple more changes need to be made. Number one, we want to take the payment schedule off. we don't want an invoice created at this time. If we have the payment schedule here, workflow is going to create the invoice. So let's take it off, and we can have it applied in the next workflow instead. Let me go back to my outline here and just make sure that we have everything. Yes. So this is going to be our initial inquiry workflow, and I am not going to start the next workflow automatically because the proposal would have required my approval anyway, and that would require me to go into the project anyway. So I'm not going to have it start automatically after the consultation. It still defeats the purpose of me controlling when that workflow gets applied and creates the invoice. So we're leaving this as is. And the next workflow, phase 2, let's open this one up, is going to start with sending the proposal. So I'm going to take these 3 actions out at the beginning, and we're going to start by sending the proposal. Do you still need an approve button on this? That's up to you. If you leave the approve button, it certainly gives you kind of one more slice of control to make sure that it's not sending until you're absolutely ready. So there's no harm in doing it. You could also leave it off and have the proposal go out as soon as the workflow starts. Something you'll want to watch out for as you split workflows up is that some triggers will be no longer able to be used. So originally, in the full workflow, we were triggering this action immediately after the appointment ends. We're no longer sending that consultation scheduler through this workflow. So we cannot trigger this action based off of that appointment. You'll see we have an error here. No scheduler templates have been added. So now, because this is the first action of this workflow, and we want to just apply the workflow to the project when we know the client is ready to proceed, we are changing this trigger to after all previous actions complete. After workflow started would also work. I find this one runs a little faster, so that's my preference. So we're going to put that in there and click apply. And I'll leave the approve on. The nice thing about that, another benefit to leaving that approve button, if you just had a consult with the client and on their individual project, you want to go in, click edit, and put in a personalization to that email before it sends. It's a really nice touch. So a good reason to have approve on there. It doesn't just go automatically. Okay, so we can still watch for the proposal to be completed within 2 days, and if not, remind the client. Small unrelated tip here, but anytime you're sending the same form again within the same workflow, so we've sent the package selection proposal in this action, sending the same exact template in this action, Dubsado is not going to add a new copy of that form. It's going to resend the one you previously sent. So that works out really well if you're doing a custom proposal. You can still send out a reminder in this fashion with another send form action and a form link so that they can be reminded. That's specifically for forms where that works. Okay, and then we have our hold actions right here. So a hold, it's kind of one of the more mystical actions in a Dubsado workflow, but I really love them because what it lets you do is hold an action below that's triggered after all previous actions complete until 2 conditions or 3 or more conditions are met, most frequently after contract is signed and after, in this case, scheduled payment is completed. So we have these 2 actions here to make sure the intake questionnaire doesn't go out until the contract is signed and the scheduled payment was completed. Speaking of the scheduled payment, we have the payment schedule on this workflow only. So one thing that could get a little dicey if you're trying to do workflows in phases, you would need to make sure that any actions that need to be triggered off the payment schedule are kind of within one workflow. If you split it up again and you have a third workflow that also has a payment schedule, that can get a little bit dicey. So if you have the payment schedule, make sure any actions that need to be triggered off of scheduled payments are within that same workflow, generally it's not an issue. Most people just want to trigger something when the deposit is paid, and then maybe later after the invoice is paid in full. And then any reminder emails, of course, are going through the payment schedule reminders. So there's usually not too much of a need, but just something to be aware of if you're splitting up. Keep all actions that are triggered by the payment schedule within the same workflow where you have that applied. And because we have the payment schedule applied here, I also am making sure that in my proposal template, in the settings, that we do not have a payment schedule here. So this is what I mentioned before. This can cause an error in your trigger. So you just want to be aware of that. Take the payment schedule off the proposal. Do put it on the workflow in the same template where you're sending the proposal. Another cool thing you can do, because you're splitting the workflow up, if you wanted to introduce an expiration date to the proposal to make sure someone doesn't say they're going to book, they don't book, and then they come back like 60 days later after your pricing has changed and they book with your old pricing, an expiration date is a good way to prevent that. You can now, because the workflow is split up, makes it easier to set one. So you can do a relative expiration date, X number of days after applied to project. So if you remember, the workflow is applying that form as soon as the workflow is applied. So now that we are applying the workflow with the proposal, pretty much at the same time that we're sending it, this is going to make a lot more sense. If I do 10 days after applied to project, but the proposal is being added in the same workflow that starts from the lead capture form, and it takes you more than 10 days to get them the proposal, it could be expired before you even send it out. And if you have reminders, that could also be a little bit embarrassing as well. So those reminders could go out before the client even received the proposal. So this lets you take advantage of that relative expiration date. Okay, let's go back into our second workflow here. We're still working on this one. So because I only want this phase 2 workflow to cover up until the client is considered booked, which would be at this point right here after contract is signed and scheduled payment completed, I'm going to remove the remainder of these actions, and those will be part of the booked workflow. And again, this kind of proposal phase, it ends up being pretty short, so don't worry about that. It's just more important to break this up to make sure we're protecting against premature, or not really premature, but anything with a project date sending to someone who didn't finish their booking. Okay, one other thing I'll add to this, we're actually going to add 2 more actions here. This is kind of a little tip. We can set this up to archive the project, maybe 10.5, give a little bit of extra buffer days after form is not completed. So what this does is it kind of takes some of the worry off. You're going to expire this proposal, and if you want to just move people off the board, if they didn't fill out the proposal within a certain number of days, you can have the workflow automatically archive the project after they have not completed the form for a few days. So we can add this in here. What's great about this, of course, is if they do complete the proposal, this action gets skipped, as does this reminder. So we don't need to worry about those going out to folks who did complete their proposal. Finally, I'm going to add an action to start a workflow. So if you remember, we didn't do this in the first phase because we want manual control over deciding if that client is ready to go ahead and book or not. So we're not going to have it automatically applied. In this case, we do want the client to get their inquiry or their intake questionnaire as soon as they complete their booking. So we want that to happen without us having to touch it. So that's why we'll use the start a workflow action. It's going to add the phase 3 workflow to the project. And I'm going to leave the trigger after all previous actions complete. And just like before, it'll wait until the contract and scheduled payment are both complete before it starts that third workflow. All right, let's look at the third one. So I'm going to go through again, and we're going to remove the actions we've already covered in the other steps. I mentioned watching out for triggers. You know, if you had something triggered off of an appointment scheduler, and now it's broken up where that action is no longer in the same workflow as that appointment scheduler being sent out, remember you got to change that trigger. Also, if you had something triggered off of a form being completed or not completed, remember that that all has to be within the same workflow where the form was sent. So now if the form is sent in one workflow and you're trying to trigger something in another workflow off of that form, it won't work. The workflows can all exist on the same project simultaneously, and they can run alongside each other, but they do not talk to one another. So just keep that in mind. Okay, so this phase 3 workflow is going to start with sending the intake questionnaire immediately after all previous actions. That's still fine. So it'll start right away as soon as it's applied. And we have a reminder there, and triggered this incorrectly when I was setting this up. Good catch. Let's see, after form is completed. So after they complete the intake questionnaire, we want the to-do to start the work. And this is just, I've put this in here as a placeholder. This would essentially be, you know, if you have lots of to-dos you want to put in, other emails, other forms you want to send, it all kind of happens in this space right here. This is, you know, where it gets really business specific. The first examples of going through an inquiry and that proposal, you could pretty much use those steps verbatim. And I included visuals in the handout that you can copy. But at this point in this booked workflow, this is heavily dependent on what's going on in your business. And then we have those last emails triggered around our imaginary project date. So we now have the peace of mind that the workflow with these actions and these triggers is not even near the project until the client has signed and paid their deposit. So now you can be confident that your client is not going to receive anything if they didn't become your client. So just to kind of round this out, let me just quick jump into a project here. As if we had created one from a lead capture form, filling that out. I'll even put in a project date real quick. So to recap, the lead capture form would apply the phase 1 inquiry workflow. So this is one change you would need to make. You would need to swap out the workflow in your lead capture form settings and make sure it's now pointing to the phase 1 workflow once you've tested everything and you're happy with it, instead of pointing to the original full workflow. So let's say the lead capture went ahead and applied that. And we're going to run through these actions. I'm just going to quickly mark completed. Mark completed is like skipping an action, if you remember. So we're just going to pretend we went through all of these. And I've had the consultation with the client. Everything went great. They're ready to move forward. You can notice at this point, we have no invoice on the project, no forms just yet. Once I apply our phase 2 workflow, we'll see a couple of changes happen. And one thing I forgot to do, don't forget this, remember to take the payment schedule out of the third workflow as well. You only want it in the same workflow where you're sending that proposal. Always good to catch those things. Okay, so you've had the consultation, you go ahead and manually apply that second workflow. Again, we did that coming to the workflows tab, apply a workflow dropdown, select the one you want to apply, and click apply. And that's all you need to do to manually apply a workflow. I promise it's not scary. Very simple and quick to do after your call with the client. So you can come in here, you have the send form, you can edit this, customize it for the conversation you just had. I'll show you in the Forms tab that proposal is now here waiting to send since we applied that workflow. And we also see our invoice created here. So the workflow has created a primary invoice with the payment schedule already lined up. And when the proposal gets filled out, those line items will just go right onto this invoice, and the client will see everything all together when they get the invoice as part of the proposal. If you've set it up that way, they would see the line items plus the payment schedule. It'll all be together on one. And then, of course, at the end, once they've booked this last workflow, phase 3 will start on its own and go from there. So that is workflows in phases.